Our next speaker is Alex Diaz. Alex has spent the last 10 years at companies like Google and Yahoo and Listable. He is currently studying to become a spin instructor in addition to his product endeavors. So I think he's got some exciting things to talk about today. Here's Alex Diaz. Hold down, yeah, if you hold that down, the button. There you go.
Hello? Okay, cool. Hey. Yeah, so I wanted just to talk today, in that time that I've been working on product management, but not spin training, that's unrelated. I've kind of made a lot of mistakes, as I'm sure you guys have, and as we just saw. In particular cases where you feel like you're doing everything you can to get the right product to come out the other end, and yet like the same mistakes keep coming up, bugs keep coming up, and it just feels like the team is stuck. And so I feel like as I've kind of done this longer and longer, I feel like I'm more and more in a topsy-turvy world where the thing I think works doesn't, so that's what I want to talk about. But to start, I wanted to like just try a little experiment. So here's how it's going to work. I'm going to clap a sequence, and then I want you guys in harmony to clap it back to me. So let's see if this works. It may not work. Okay. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, so on 3, 1, 2, 3. Okay, can you try it once more? Let's do it again on 3. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, it was good at the beginning. But not what I was hoping for. So let's try a different thing. Instead, there's a song, I think everyone knows this, the Wedding March. So what I want you to do is to clap, you know, the famous part from that song on 3. So I think everyone knows what it is. Okay, so let's try that. 1, 2, 3. There you go. Okay, so that was like way better, right? So I think you could probably figure out it was the same tune the whole time. That's also probably the only time that song will be played for me. But no. So like, what happened? Like, why did we? Thank you. Why did we do that? So I think to me, I mean, it's a silly example, but I find something like that happens all the time, at least with me and my teams, where I feel like I'm being super clear on what to do. I'm eliminating any ambiguity. I'm like, here are the mocks, here's the product spec, here's a PRD, here's the Trello cards. Like, it is clear, right? And basically what I'm saying is like, do this, right? And you're not getting the same results back. And I think a lot of times it's because there's a song sort of playing in your head that's not in the team's head. And I think the main thing is figuring out how can we actually share the song instead of the clapping. Originally I wrote this and I said the clap, and that was not as good. So I mean, for me this is like very different than when I started. Certainly I thought when I started like, okay, cool, how to be a great PM. I think get in all the information from the world, think about it, go on a mountain, figure out the right answer, impart it on the world, and ship it to users. And that, I think, maybe is not complete. There's a lot of mistakes that I've made that have made me question that view. But the main one was there was one time where I was leaving a product that I really, really cared about. And I was like, cool, let me make sure the next PM doesn't screw this up, right? Because like, I have an idea of how I want it to be, and I'm really excited about it. And so I like masterminded, and I'm like, I'm gonna get this guy to talk to this guy, and this guy to take over the thing, and like House of Cards, you know, the whole thing. And after it all worked out, I was like, whoa, maybe I should have just done that the whole time. Like, why was I not just doing the things that was causing the right thing to happen without me? And so I think more and more, I try to think about maybe my job a little bit differently. This may or may not work for everyone, but I think I try to think less and less about what is the product that I want to make and what are the specifics of it, and more think about I'm creating this machine, this thing, this sort of team input hybrid thing that is actually spitting out products and features and experiences. And if I really spend my time investigating that, all sorts of good things hopefully will happen on the other end. This is kind of how I visualize things. I mean, it's obviously simplistic, but like, what is a team? It's a set of people, tools, and processes that transform sort of an understanding of the world and context and user priorities, and they spit out features and experiences on the other side. And more I try to worry, less and less I try to worry about kind of the specifics of the output and what that should look like, and more kind of what's happening on this left side, like really understanding that and really molding and optimizing that. I'll give you an example, maybe to make it concrete. At the last startup I worked for, it was like sort of freelancer management software. And basically, there was an invoice approvals flow. So as a supplier, if you were a photographer, you would submit to the company, let's say ASOS, you would submit an invoice, and then ASOS can approve it, right? And so we were building this feature, and like, it was so buggy all the time, like over and over, we kept getting more and more bugs. And would go in and be like, okay, cool, like we'll totally fix this. We weren't really clear on what it was, so like let's make a lot of Trello cards, let's make some flow charts, let's update the mocks because they were like out of date, like let's all do this. And it kept happening, and we were shipping it to customers. And I got really upset. I'm like, how could these engineers, if they're so smart, like make such stupid mistakes? And I meant it rhetorically, but then I thought like, wait, maybe I should actually find out why is this happening, right? There's obviously something that's causing this to happen, and I don't think it's any lack of detail. So, essentially, like what's happening over here that's causing the craziness on the right? And so I actually sat down with one of the engineers, and he's walking through, no bugs in the whole thing. Everything seems to be working fine. And so I noticed, though, luckily, he had like signed in on an account, a test account. And I knew that it was a supplier. Stick with me for a second. It was a supplier test account, and there was the supplier that was approving things. And I was like, that's interesting. Why did you choose that account? And he's like, oh, to test the approval thing. And I said, well, who is it that approves invoices? And he like looked at me confused. Some of you are looking at me confused now, but that's okay. And he's like, oh, I guess the supplier. So I asked around, and I got very different answers on this question. Some people thought kind of an invoice was sort of a work record that's owned by the company and the employee, and they both sort of edit it like a Google Doc. There was very different views on what should happen and kind of how the world actually works. But there was really a very clear thing, which is supplier submits an invoice and a company approves it. And so essentially there was like a song that was going on in my head that I assumed everyone was hearing, which is basically how invoices work, and it wasn't there. And that, just once we clarified that, then everything else became obvious, and we didn't have to do any of that other crap, just by focusing sort of on the inputs. And so I think for me, the most important thing a PM can do is really get alignment. We talk a lot about alignment, and often we mean we end up aligning on the mocks and on all the specifics of what the feature should do. Actually, I think it's much more interesting and important to align on the inputs, on sort of the understanding of the world that leads to a particular solution. And you could imagine the PM here as basically dumping into the team kind of context, problem statements, user studies, mental models, anything that the team then transforms into a solution. The head of product management at Google, he used to say that a PM is just an expensive router, which I like that he said expensive, so that was good. That was good for me. But basically that's what you do. You get information from a certain group or set of people that you think is relevant to everyone else and kind of dump it into the machine. We all know the many ways that we do this. Obviously, things like setting goals and objectives, right, is really important. I'm all about meeting notes. It turns out if you do that in a very precise way, and if you take control of the meeting notes, you're essentially sort of doing that alignment of inputs and mental models and how people are thinking about things. Sometimes what I like to do is kind of forward either examples from others, without saying what I think should happen, sort of forward examples from other domains where people have solved the problem and be like, oh, what do you think this means for us? This kind of thing. But the most important thing, obviously, is to ask questions. Just by asking questions, people think along a certain line. But also, until you understand what's in everyone's head, you don't understand what's missing, right, from their heads. And you don't know what is that minimum amount of additional information that you drop kind of into it. And I think we've all had the experience where just putting two people in contact with each other leads to this amazing sort of chain reaction of efforts. So I think that's another key tool that you can do, is just get people to talk to each other. I think there's a temptation always to kind of hard code the answer by inputting the solution into the machine that I just described. But I think, to me, that's ineffective and cheating. It's kind of like, there's this thing called like Searle's Chinese room. So it's like a counter argument to the Turing test. And he says, imagine you have this guy in a box, and on the left, there are like Chinese characters coming in, and he has a set of instructions on what Chinese characters to put out the other side. And let's say that by doing this, he's actually answering questions in Chinese. Can you say, though, that the guy in the box really speaks Chinese? And I think intuitively, a lot of us would say no. And I think that's kind of what happens when we just get really, really prescriptive. And it's often our temptation to get prescriptive, especially when we're not getting the results that we expect. But as much as it's the temptation, it doesn't at least work for me. For one thing, when I give instructions, I'm often wrong. The great thing about not describing the solution is that you're never wrong about it. Because you basically say, here's a problem statement, and I've always been surprised at people coming up with better things than me. Also, when you kind of give instructions of what to do and you describe the product, obviously people are less excited in bringing it into reality. It's also a lot more work. It's much easier to just say like, hey, like here's the world. Are we excited about it? Let's go. Than to actually go and create all the Trello cards and all that stuff. Plus, it's never enough. Like I've never been in a situation where people have asked me for less detail on stuff. So the more you do it, it's kind of spiraling. So I try to avoid that. And luckily, hopefully, it's not just me. There's the head of engineering has a really good article on First Round where he has this thing called quantum management, and he uses an analogy to Schrodinger's cat, which is a little complicated, but basically his point is like, you know, as a manager, increasingly, when you actually put in ideas, you're constraining the set of options, and you're not really pushing any of them forward. And if you can just hold back your ego and not try to actually prescribe the solution, you can get really, really amazing results. And so that's kind of, for me, a very different way of thinking about it than I started. In fact, it's so different that it's hard for me still. So like I get it in my head. It's like problem solved. I know what it is. So what I try to do in those situations is that if something's really obvious to me, but it's not obvious to other people, I try to walk back and say, what were the 2 or 3 things that made this, that when I learned it, made this so obvious to me. So like maybe I had a conversation with someone, maybe I read an article about something, and then I'll just share that part, right, without sharing kind of the conclusion that I reached. It happened at Google. There was basically Knowledge Graph was this new effort, and we were on local, and I'm like, feels like we should be working with Knowledge Graph. But rather than saying that, I just got basically the engineering lead of my team to be like, oh my God, there's this crazy project Knowledge Graph. Like, do you know anything about it? And he's like, oh, I guess I'll find out. And he came back, he's like, we should go into Knowledge Graph. I'm like, cool, okay. So I think that's kind of one way that I find to kind of do this without doing it. Sometimes you do all that, you're like alignment of inputs, everyone's on the same page, we're all excited, and then like still things don't work. There's like execution problems and so on. In other words, in that diagram that you saw before, like the engine is sort of broken in some way. And that for me is the second role of the PM, is to go in there and kind of fix this engine, right? So that with the right inputs, good stuff comes out the other end. Generally, these are the things that I find don't work in the engine. Sometimes it's people, process, and tools. So with people, like, okay, none of this works unless you can assume that people are smart, rational, and motivated. And in my opinion, if you can't assume that on a team, unless you have control over hiring, like anyway, I leave, right? Like I can't work in that environment. It's very difficult for me. Obviously, if I'm hiring, like it's my responsibility to change it, but you have to be able to assume that about the people you work for. But even then, you know, things like culture, you know, things like trust, these are all things that you have to build on the people side of things, I think, for this to work. And then I won't go too much into processes and tools. I mean, you guys know, is it Agile, is it Waterfall, is it Jira, is it Sprint Planning, is it Slack, like all that kind of stuff, I think really, really does matter. And I think one way that I think about it is basically the tools and processes you have are actually the perfect tools for the results that you're getting, right? And so if you want different results, you kind of have to change that machinery, right? And again, we know how we do this. We ask a lot of questions. Oh, why did this bug get addressed? Why didn't this bug get addressed? Like really understand kind of how that engine is working. And then, you know, debug it and say, is there a different process that does a better job? And it'll constantly change. At one of the startups I was just at, the team had just moved to Jira and to do kind of more sort of structured sprint planning. But it was obvious that we couldn't see 2 weeks into the future. Like the customer requests were coming in on a daily basis. And so we actually scrapped it and said, let's just do a simple Kanban style, like Trello board or whatever. And eventually we actually moved back to Jira. So it's not like a right or wrong. It's just like, what is the optimal thing for the results you want to get right now? For me, I kind of wrote all this stuff off as like, like, I guess I have to do this, but it really should be my engineering manager or project manager or product owner. And I kind of saw me doing it as a stopgap. I think now increasingly I see it as like one of the most powerful levers that I have. Obviously I partner with those people, but if you really understand this and can affect it, I think the results are significant with relatively little effort on your part. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of the overall summary here. For me, I'm like trying to always fight the urge to say what to build, especially when you're not getting it. And instead to say what would make it so that the right thing would happen without me doing anything at all, and then focus on making that thing. Now, this is a little weird, I'll say, because when the team is doing best, you're actually doing the least, which is kind of like a funny situation. And I remember there was the head of search at Google once said, you know, all I do is hire people, fire people, and decide where they sit. And like at the time, I thought what he meant was like Google, it's like cash cow, like search is great, there's nothing to do, my job is the easiest in the world. Now I realize what he meant, which is like his job is to sort of affect the people, and then also, and essentially what the team is, and also the input, so who's talking to each other. And what he meant, I think, was that those are the only tools he has, but they're also the only tools he needs to really run a really successful product like Google Search. I'll say again, it feels like super weird. It feels like really indirect and inefficient. I've talked to founders about this, and they're like, you know, that's a really cool way to do it for like Googlers that get massaged all day in big companies where you have all the time to spare everyone's feelings. But you know what? Like Steve Jobs never sat around and like did 3 levels of indirection. You know, some people say that like it feels kind of like Inception, like this elaborate plan to like plant a seed in someone's mind that then gets the result that you want. And if you don't do it, if you do it, I mean, there's a way to do it poorly where you're like, you already know the answer you want and you're just trying to get it. And I think people pick up on that. So you need to have an open mind. The other, I think, possible criticism of it is like kind of like a Dilbert thing is like, well, if you're acting this way, you're basically going around asking a lot of questions, never taking a side, and so you're never really wrong. And the funny thing happens is that when you disappear is exactly when the team seems to be doing best. So really, what value are you adding? Good points. I mean, I feel like I don't know if it's true or not. I mean, I think certainly that's probably a perception of some people. I think if maybe by this way of thinking, good PMs and bad PMs look really similar. I don't know. For me, I just do it this way because it basically has worked for me. Generally, the more I try to act this way, I find the teams are happier, the products that come out are better than I would have designed myself. Again, and this is a theme, it's much less work. And it allows me eventually to obsolete myself and scale to other problems, like spin instruction, I guess. But yeah, and so that's kind of my story up to now with kind of product management, my evolution. It worked for me. Maybe you guys have a different approach. I'd love to hear about it, but that's it. Thanks.
That's great. I think we can all identify with trying to take too much control, so it's nice to hear a different perspective on how you can be successful without doing that. Do we have questions in the room? We've got a couple microphones running around. Right here in the front.
Thank you. Oh my God. What are you doing with developers that tell you, okay, you want me to make a concept or something like this, and I only want to develop and to code it down, and they are like, okay, I do not want to make a concept, and so.
Yeah, I've had that. I've definitely had that. When I was in, there was a team I was working with. I guess I shouldn't say which one. That's fine, I'll say it. Like, it was a fantasy football team, and they were in London, and the exact same thing happened, and it had gotten there, I think, because like you eventually build certain patterns and the culture emerges that like this is what PMs do, like give me like 500 user stories or I don't know what to do. And I think you have to change the culture basically, I think, for that to happen. And with any culture change, I don't think, for me, I didn't try to fix it overnight. Instead, what I tried to do in that case was find the engineers that were excited to kind of take ownership of a project, give them that, let them run with it, and then really celebrate the victories that those people had. And eventually that kind of, I think, told the team, like, this is how we expect you to behave. like this is how you can really do something, and this is also more fun. It sort of sets a pattern that I think other people can follow. I hope that on any team, there's someone that does want to operate with very little direction, but it's a hard thing. It's like a culture change thing.
Another one right here in the middle.
Thank you. Great presentation. Since you focus more on the why and the input, I was wondering if you actually put some specific processes or like overall practices around collecting, structuring these inputs.
Yeah, nothing comes to mind particularly. Let me think about this for a second. I think, what are the inputs? I mean, there's a lot of inputs, and the things that are going to come up anyway, like you do a user study or you find, competitive research. So I'll kind of put those aside. I think one key piece of input is kind of an understanding, sharing kind of a mental model of the world and how you approach it. So, to use, let me think of an example. Let's say there's a product and what we really feel is like, go back to fantasy football, that basically the core idea of leagues is dead and doesn't make sense on the phone, and we're going to bet on this idea that that you should just be able to play with your friends kind of like Bejeweled or something like that. So how do you get to that kind of view of like what a really exciting product is? For me, I do like a lot of brainstorming sessions, because if you do it right, in the end you can say like, we have this choice. We can either see the world this way or that way, because like a lot of ideas will fall into two categories, and then as a group you kind of make a decision. But I think it's getting to those mental models and sharing them. And I think it's important to be a facilitator there and not a contributor. So.
Any others? Oh, one right up here in the top.
Great presentation and hilarious. I like the point about not prescribing your solution to the rest of the team, and I'm wondering how you can communicate the same message to maybe people who work above you, who in that fashion.
Yeah, let me think about that one. Well, okay. I mean, I'm trying. I'll be honest. It's a very hard problem, and it's a similar problem to what it's. To me, it's analogous to sometimes your managers really want to talk about deadlines, but then your team is all about like, it'll be ready when it's ready, like agile. So how do you deal with that? And what I try to do is kind of honestly just tell each side what they want to hear. So, from the manager's perspective, like totally we have a plan, here's the prototypes, here's a demo, like whatever, and then like completely like not like share that to the team. That's what I do. I don't know.